I'm going to help you out on it.
All right, I appreciate it. I'm Jeffrey Letino. I'm here with best-selling author Andrew Braiant, motivational speaker, and we are behind Red Square to talk about what makes for a successful entrepreneur.
For sure. Well, firstly, it's great to be here in Russia. This is my first time in Moscow. I have to say I've been blown away by, well, we went to an art museum, the size of the art, amazing, and the surprising friendliness of the Russian people. They don't always let us know because they don't smile as much, but very friendly people. Thanks for your hospitality.
Right. We were speaking a little bit earlier about personality traits, and it was very interesting to hear what actually is the science behind success in business.
Okay, well, there are traits that are indicative of what would make a successful entrepreneur. And a lot of the research, some of it by a very good friend of mine, Michel Duval in Australia, shows that it is surprising. If you go off and do an MBA, Masters of Business Administration, they make you do, a business plan and mark out. But if we look at some famous business plans that didn't work, that got bad marks but did work, right? Like in the logistics field, the reality is that entrepreneurs don't plan. Entrepreneurs actually have a big picture vision of where they're going. So entrepreneurs are very good at the big picture, but can zoom into the detail. And the real secret of being an entrepreneur is the ability to pivot. So the 5-year plan, the 10-year plan is actually not the sign of an entrepreneur.
Well, that's interesting. So Elon Musk sat there with no business plan. He said, I want to go to the moon, I want to make electric cars, this and that. How does he get from the idea to having the success?
Well, the very good thing about entrepreneurs is that they paint a vision where other people want to get behind it, right? So there is no shortage of people applying for jobs at Google, right? Because people want to be part of that. And so people who have a lesser vision connect to those individuals, and then they execute that, right? And it is that vision and the excitement. I mean, if we look at, Steve Jobs was not a great people manager. But his vision for Apple meant that he got a lot of great people around him, and they executed the product.
Well, we talked about Elon Musk and Steve Jobs, people that we'd consider extroverts, right? What about the rest of us that maybe don't have the people skills or don't have the ability to transfer in such a fashionable way?
Okay, so with the utmost respect, and I know you're only asking this as a question, because if somebody asked me that question as a coach, I'd blow you straight out of the water. because that question contains within it the seeds of an excuse. But what about me? I don't have the right personality, I don't have the background, right? And that's the difference. An entrepreneur would never make that excuse. They would never say, I'm not an extrovert, all right? Because in fact, you don't have to be an extrovert to be an entrepreneur, all right? You have to have the vision, you have to have the drive, you have to have the idea, and then get people around that, and you have to be able to pivot very quickly. So the entrepreneur would never make the excuse. Right. So anybody who says, but what about me, I don't have this, is not an entrepreneur, because the entrepreneur, the unique and very special, they'd never make the excuse. Right. There you go.
You've done some really interesting writing and your videos, which you can find online on YouTube and on your website. You do also an awful lot of coaching with high-level executives as well, big companies. Maybe the opposite of entrepreneurs, or maybe they're entrepreneurial in their role, but we're talking about big companies like airlines and things like that. Yeah. What do you tell those guys?
Well, it's interesting. So the word entrepreneur comes from the French entreprendre, to undertake, and it originally meant to undertake a journey and the risk of a journey. And it was the French economist Jean-Baptiste Say who coined the term entrepreneur to mean to undertake the risk in business. Mm-hmm. And so whether if you're a senior executive, you're still undertaking risk. Right. You're undertaking that risk for your organization. If you're an entrepreneur startup, you don't have the structure around you. But if you're in a big business and you're at a senior enough level that your decisions do make a difference, then you're undertaking risk. Because if you make the wrong decision, you're out. Right? So it's still entrepreneur. It is still undertaking risk. So it is the same issues. Do you have the vision? Are you communicating the vision? Have you put the team together that can execute that vision? And so those things are very similar. The difference with the startup is that they have that flexibility. Their issues is that they have no infrastructure, and sometimes they need to learn how to put that structure around them. The bigger business needs to sometimes know how to deconstruct, because if an organization gets too big, it gets too rigid, it gets too fat, and it doesn't have the adaptability. So agile thinking, being able to insulate the creative part of the business from sometimes the operational part of the business, because otherwise people say, oh, we can't do that, it's too risky. So the same issues, just it's the question is there a lot of structure or no structure? You have to think about how you execute in those environments.
You talk about structure in large and small companies. Let's talk a little bit about development. You have your staff they're going to execute that vision. You need to grow them. As a leader, how do you take someone that's maybe good at one thing and groom them to take that next step?
Okay, so for me, in English, there's two words that get used interchangeably. And so my research, I wrote 2 books on the topic of self-leadership. And self-leadership is all about taking ownership, and that really is key around the entrepreneur. They take ownership for results, right? So ownership or responsibility is something that was totally within our control. So I'm responsible for what I think, what I feel, what I say, what I do. We've met each other an hour ago. I'm certainly not responsible for what you think, what you say, and what you do. I have no responsibility for you, right? My children are young, so I'm responsible for them because they're not yet responsible for themselves. A lot of managers think they're responsible for their staff, and I think that is a very codependent relationship. Husbands think they're responsible for their wives, but if their wives are smart and intelligent, they're not. But they are accountable. So unfortunately in business, people use the responsibility and accountability interchangeably, but what I do when I coach is I make those two very separate concepts. I'm responsible for me. If I'm working with somebody, I want them to be responsible for themselves. I'm not their mummy, I'm not their daddy, I'm not there to change their diapers. I want to hire people who are going to take that ownership and responsibility. And to be effective, I need to articulate the accountability. So on a sports team, we're accountable to kick goals at the other end, and we're accountable to the team. And sport's a good analogy. It's where I originally came from, was working with sports teams. If one player is making it all about themselves and not about the team, they're not going to be successful. And I'm responsible for what I do, but I'm accountable for what everybody has agreed we need to do. And good leaders make that clear, crystal clear. You're responsible for turning up and doing your job, and you're accountable because you agreed to be accountable to these outcomes. And the key issue is that communication, 2 ways, because communication is always 2 ways, that everybody knows what they're accountable for. And when I go into a high-performing team, that's what I see. When I get called in, which nobody usually calls me in for a high-performing team, they usually call me in because the team is not performing, nobody's taking responsibility and nobody's clear about their accountability. And then if I turn that around for a company, then that's worth millions or billions of dollars.
Is there a key, we talked about high performance teams, this and that, but at the end of the day, it always starts with that single entrepreneur that has that idea, and he's got a long journey. Is there a key in your history of your work that you've seen the same character trait or the same approach over and over, where it's been successful, it's led to high performance teams and successful outcomes?
Well, actually, the quality is resilience, right? Because very few entrepreneurs have made it the first time, right? And the answer was laden into your question, in case you hadn't spotted that, right? It's always resilience, because most people who haven't been successful, they tried something, didn't work, and they go, oh, I'm going to give up and I'll go back into a job, right? Very few entrepreneurs made it the first time, right? They pivoted. Even Netflix, originally started as a DVD delivery service, not a streaming service.
Pivot. Let's speak a bit more specifically about that. Not everyone understands maybe exactly what that, the situation of, I'm here, this is not working, and I need to react to the situation and find a different exit. Can you speak a little bit more about what exactly is the right time and place?
Well, yeah, that's the art form. I mean, that's the $1 million question. When is the right time? But it's the ability to disrupt. So, from my own personal story, So my first degree was in physiotherapy, and then I got involved in the fitness industry. I coached sports teams. I set up a chain of clinics in Australia, and I built this wonderful wellness center. And then in the year 2000, my business was disrupted by the fitness chains that came in. I was charging $49 a month. They were charging $49 a year. I got wiped out. So I went from wealthy to zero. And so I experienced being disrupted. Then I built back up again, and I built a coaching and training business, which I'm involved in now. But when the global financial crisis hit, I had offices and I had staff. I got disrupted again. Beginning last year, this time I said, I'm not going to be disrupted again. I'm going to disrupt myself. You mentioned you met me on video before you met me in person.
Right.
So, beginning last year, I pivoted a lot of my coaching programs into the cloud, virtual. I'll do a live session, and that gets recorded, and that gets resold. And so I pivoted myself, right? So just using a personal story. So the good CEO or the good entrepreneur is constantly asking, how do I disrupt myself before somebody else disrupts me? And so if you have resilience plus this, and the reality is that they do not get wedded to the product. See, when you fall in love with your own product or service, then you can't give it up, right? But the entrepreneur has a very, the expression, they're an agnostic view, right? So if Netflix was wedded to the DVD, they couldn't have pivoted. Right. You see, where Kodak was wedded to the film, to the actual physical film, and then they didn't pivot as well, right? So it's that agnostic view of your product or service. It's about what the customer wants, not what you think they want. All right, and so that's a clear. So with resilience and that willingness to say, well, I love it, but nobody else does, so let's move on to what they want.
It's very interesting. I'm a fan of Jim Collins and Good to Great and books like that. He does that very well, explains how that develops. You travel quite a bit. You've spoken in 20-some countries in front of a variety of different audiences. Differences across cultures. Does it play a big part in business?
So the answer to that is yes and no. All right. So if I had $1 for every time somebody said that's not our culture, my children's very expensive private education would be well funded. So people use culture, but what is culture? Culture is a collection of norms and values. So a norm is an accepted behavior, a value is an aspiration to a behavior. Good, funny joke about that is Fons Trompenas, who's a friend of mine and a researcher on culture, always says that integrity, of course, is in everybody's value statement, but it should be a norm, not a value. Right. Because if we have to write that we value integrity, it means we didn't have it, right? So we should have integrity as a norm. Right? So culture is the way people behave, right? And here I am in Russia. It's my first time. I'm probably going to put my foot in my mouth somewhere. So it does matter that we understand context, and then it doesn't matter because humans are humans. And humans are always driven by the same aspirations and the same drives and the same fears. So at the individual level, we can connect with people. At a slightly larger level, culture plays a bigger part, right? And so whether that is a corporate culture or it's a country culture. I visit India and I visit Pakistan. It was one country once upon a time. Right. The people are the same. Right? I mean, some of them are related across the border, but the governments are different and have different cultures, and so therefore there is the conflict, right? But people are always the same.
So going back to your point of taking ownership and self-performing, in Russia we have more of a top-down culture where people wait to see, which way the boss wants to go, the wind blows, okay, and reacts to that. You don't think that's an issue with the culture? You think it's just an issue with leadership?
Oh no, the leadership in this case is the culture, because the leader articulates the culture that they want, right? So if culture is the collective values and norms, it's the leader's job to say this is the new norm, right? And it's a reality that leaders can do that. The thing about top-down culture is it works when there's high levels of uncertainty, right? If you're on an aeroplane, right, and the oxygen masks do fall from the ceiling and smoke comes around your ankles, if the pilot came out of the cockpit and said, ladies and gentlemen, we've got a bit of a problem, I'd like to create some focus groups and see what I should do about this, you would be going, the atheists would be having religion at that point, right? So there are top-down, when top-down leadership works. So here's what I talk about when it comes to leadership. And this is based in psychology, path goal theory from the 1970s, is that leadership always has three components, and like a stool that doesn't wobble, right? 3 legs. It has the leadership style, it has the follower's motivation, and it has the environment. So in the case that I explained, if there is high volatility, like a military situation, high volatility, uncertainty, people don't know what to do, you need a top-down leader to say, do this, right? However, if you're dealing in the tech industry or the medical industry where you have highly trained individuals who know their subjects, all right, and it's a fairly stable environment, and you try and do top-down, they're not going to respond well. Right. You need a much more participative leader who's going to bring out the best in the people. So you've got to get that algorithm right. What is the context? What's the environment? What's the leader's style? And the best leaders have a variety of styles. They don't have one size fits all. And that's self-awareness. And the work I do with leaders is all around the self-awareness. What's my strongest style? I do directive really well. I can tell people what to do, right? And that works, right? But I have learned to be a coach and to come back and bring out the best in other people. So I can do. There are basically 5 styles. And if you can master at least 4 of those, you'll be a very flexible leader. Now, some leaders, I'm coaching a leader right now who stepped up into a position and he's very participative, but he actually needs to be directive because he's going to take his organization through a piece of change where he's going to have to tell people what to do. And I'm coaching him to be directive.
Looking to him for
so he needs to step up. So it's all about doing a diagnostic. What is the environment? Where are the people at? Are they trained? Are they motivated? If they're lost, they're unmotivated, you've got to have to be directive.
Fascinating stuff. Ekvium is a business club for high-impact entrepreneurs in Russia. Andrew will be speaking tonight. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you. My pleasure.